Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How a Consumer-Focused Approach Can Transform the Patient Financial Experience. I'm Jacob Emerson with Becker's Hospital Review. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. We're going to begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you can type those into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. Lastly, if at any time you have trouble with the audio or video, please try refreshing your browser first. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We are here to help you at any time. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. First is Preeti Shah, who serves as the Chief Product Officer at Finvi. Preeti brings 20-plus years of corporate and product strategy experience to the Finvi executive leadership team. In her role as Chief Product Officer, Preeti is responsible for developing the vision of Finvi's product portfolio strategy and roadmap to ensure they are building and delivering the best possible client experiences. John Talaga serves as Executive Vice President and General Manager of Healthcare at Flywire. As Flywire's Executive Vice President of Healthcare, John leads the company's healthcare business practice, serving health networks, hospitals, and group practices across the country. He joined Flywire after the company he co-founded, On Plan Holdings, was acquired by Flywire in 2018. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Today, Preeti and John are going to be talking about how a consumer-focused approach in healthcare can transform the patient financial experience. During today's presentation, they're going to dive a bit deeper into some new trends impacting patients' ability and willingness to pay, as well as shifts in revenue cycle workforces, how those trends are resulting in emerging revenue cycle management best practices, and how technology supports and enables the implementation of those best practices. So without further ado, I'll first pass it over to John.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate that. Definitely want to kind of start this out by level setting on the foundational problem that we have with patients today when it comes to consumerism and the patient financial experience, and ultimately resulting in payment. First, we have an affordability crisis. I think people on this call probably hear a lot about this in terms of patients having higher deductibles and higher out-of-pockets, and having a lot of difficulty paying their bills. And when you look at some of the stats that we've done through surveys, is 85% of these consumers are super concerned about the medical cost in general. So even before they have a service, there's concern with budget and, gee, what if my child gets sick? What if I get sick? And then when they do, and they go into the hospital or the physician office, almost 50% of those patients can't afford to pay for their illness or service in one lump sum. I always use the stat that the average balance for a hospital stay is right around $1,200 across multiple hospitals that we've looked at, and the average savings that the average consumer has is about $400 that they could be able to spend on this. So there's a huge gap there just in general that we have to be aware of. And then the other part of affordability I think is probably even more concerning is that almost 40% of consumers have postponed or canceled treatments in the last year because of the cost of what they were going to have to pay. And that's very counter to what I think hospitals are trying to drive in terms of having a proactive care. Then on the other side of things with affordability is consumers, like any industry, have a higher demand than ever for convenience when it comes to their payments. So 84% of those consumers believe that healthcare payment system needs to be streamlined. And I think all of us as consumers would probably agree with that. And we're certainly focused on that mission. 77% want to pay for an unexpected bill in installments. So we're in a subscription economy. Consumers are used to paying things monthly and being able to budget for those things. So having the ability and access to do that with their medical services is there as well. And I do want to just mention one thing is that, payment plans as an example is nothing new in healthcare, right? But the thing that traditionally they've really been treated or used as a tactic of last resort, rather than a strategic method for being able to help serve patients with for affordability problems as well as collections. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then the last one is 55% say that hardly any providers offer consumer-friendly billing approach. So the good news is that's not 90%. So we actually have made a lot of progress across health systems in terms of adding online and adding text and email and things like that. But there's the next level that we can serve those 55% that's still considered to be unfriendly.
Thanks, John. And so picking up pretty much from where John left off, where he's articulated that the affordability problem is here and consumerism is creeping in, the second trend sort of touches on both, which is, and can be summarized under optionality. What we are seeing increasingly in the market is that there is a desire for consumers to have self-service options, and they want to have a lot of different options by which that are digital and self-service, by which they want to sort of interact and engage with their providers. And what's been really interesting to observe through a lot of the surveys that we've done, as well as the published research out there, is that honestly, these preferences are not what we had originally assumed. So the millennials, for instance, we always envisioned are going to want to have the ability to sort of interact in a digital way. But what's really, what sort of revealed itself in the past few months is that actually even the baby boomers, almost 50% of them want to have mobile-friendly digital connections with their providers. And so it is really transcending across all different generations. And we can always ask ourselves the question that when did this pivot actually take place? And I sort of anchored it back to the fact that consumers don't check in their retail tendencies just because they're trying to interact with the healthcare provider. Today, most people are used to placing orders on Amazon and getting invoices on their mobile devices on Amazon. And that's pretty much the way they want to also now start interacting with their healthcare providers. So net, what I would say is that patients of all ages are expecting a modern financial experience as they sort of think through the continuum of financial, of their patient financial experience. So, the third trend that I sort of wanted to touch on, and I'll invite John to sort of add to this, is the trend around fluid patient financial circumstances. In today's day and age, I think it's really become imperative for providers to understand that a patient's financial status is not going to be static and that it's going to be fluid. This has become increasingly known and has been accelerated primarily due to COVID and the Great Resignation. So what really providers have to keep in mind as they're trying to service the financial needs of their patients is that they've got to sort of meet the patients where they are financially, and they can only do so if they have the right data around that patient. And unfortunately, the reality is today, most providers are not equipped with the data, the tools, or the system that they need to adapt in time. And so I wanted to kind of touch on the example that we have here, right? So you have a typical patient, Joe. His financial circumstances, as you can see on this timeline, have changed pretty dramatically in the short 2 years. His elective surgery that he had back in 2019 was purely covered through the commercial insurance that he had through his employer. As he went into retirement, obviously, his financial circumstances changed, and then it sort of got more complicated because he now has some sort of unforeseen health issue that has come up that now needs to be addressed. So if you are that provider system or that orthopedic practice that's really providing these services, it's going to be really, really imperative that you're able to adapt to his new coverage status and his new financial circumstances. So John, would love for you to add a little bit more to this, because I know you've got so much experience in this as well.
Yeah, just to add on a little bit to what Preeti said, I think, the struggle, as she mentioned, often lies with just having access to this real-time patient data, right? And, you look at this example of Joe that we have up here. If a customer service rep, or a financial assistance representative of the hospital sat down with Joe personally and went through what he needs and what his circumstance is, that would be a great experience for Joe, right? But how do we apply machine learning to do it across the patient base, where you can't meet, obviously, with patients one-on-one? Traditionally, propensity to pay has been a way to guide staff to be able to communicate with patients one-on-one. But the problem with propensity to pay, it's extremely static, right? It's really just based on how a consumer has paid bills overall over time. And I think the trick here that we really need to look at is what is that patient's current circumstance, gathering that information of what is their employment status, what is, their employment status could have been different a week ago from when they had the service versus when the bill's ready to go out. What's their credit to debt ratio? Like, what is their true capacity to pay? What is their income in terms of what they're being billed and asked to pay as well? So I think in order to kind of avoid some of the sort of disconnects with those patients, and we're going to unpack this a little further and give you a little deeper example of how the AI and machine learning can apply to this. But in order to kind of avoid some of the bad experiences, we truly need to personalize each financial journey for each patient and not treat them like an account and a bill and a balance, but treat them like a patient. And you really need to equip both the staff as well as the engagement with the patient with those tools to be able to help shed light on what that personal and financial shift is, so that they can adapt to the needs of the patient individually.
So with that, let's move to the fourth trend that we wanted to touch on. And, this one is not going to catch any of you guys by surprise, which is the world around us has changed pretty dramatically. And remote workforce, which was probably frowned upon maybe 2 years ago, has sort of become mainstream and is definitely here to stay. So we looked at some of the patient-centric trends, but the reality is for RCM teams and leaders of RCM teams, the complications that sort of have crept in around managing a remote workforce complicates the patient financial journey and the kinds of services that they are going to be able to provide to their patients to make sure that the patient experience is top of mind. So when you sort of take a step back for remote workforce, here are some of the things that I think we are hearing, right? 75% of the health systems are now sort of making peace with the fact that they're going to have to absolutely manage a remote workforce, or at a very minimum, at least a hybrid workforce. This also brings the challenge of staffing shortages, right? So a lot of the projections are stating that staffing shortages are going to continue. So attracting and retaining talent for RCM staff has become another thing that you've got to keep in mind. And then last but not the least, I think one of the things that you've got to touch on is that as an RCM leader, how do you make sure that you've got the right data, the right support systems in place to help get your remote workforce actually successful at what you do, so that ultimately the patient financial experience continues to be unhampered and basically, stellar. And in order to do that, we will again unpack some of the things that you can keep in mind so that you're constantly motivating and supporting this remote workforce and making that adjustment. But I did want to call out that this is something that we are hearing more and more from the market, that as people are beginning to pivot and demand a remote work from home need, most provider organizations and RCM staff team members are going to have to keep that in mind as they plan for success in the coming years.
Yeah, and so to play on those 4 trends, and the last one in particular that Preeti was mentioning with the remote workforce, there really has to be a strategy and just really kind of a new best practice for revenue cycle management in terms of how patients are engaged. And while there's, kind of look at, I think every hospital business office is always looking to use staff less, right? How do we automate? How do we give self-service to the patients where they can have a great experience at any time of day without having to interact with staff? Now, they're going to have to interact with staff at some level. We're not going to get rid of all of it, but how do we just make those interactions sort of the ones that are needed, right? The absolute ones that have to go into detail. But really, when we look at how we kind of change this whole best practice of revenue cycle, we look at these 4 things, and I would start with first, actually the second one, which is, the advanced segmentation strategy. So we have the segmentation first, right? We have to understand what that patient's capacity to pay is. We have to understand what their communication profile is. Do they like getting text? Do they like getting email, paper? Do they like to chat? Those type of profiles that we understand about the patient. Also using various things of dynamic scoring so that, like we mentioned earlier, and Preeti's going to dive into that detailed segmentation scoring in more detail. But once we have this information in real time about that patient, it enables us to be a lot more strategic about how we engage that patient and utilizing omni-channel ways of engaging. So as an example, we want to be able to not only have patients opt in to be able to say, I want to receive text or email. We want to be knowing up front that we have a mobile number, we have an email, we obviously have their address, and then actually engage the patient to learn how they're responding so that we can then apply and inform future interactions with that patient based on how they're interacting with you. So that's a true omni-channel. It isn't just multimodal. That's important to have those, but it's really having them all interact and work together to be able to serve the patient and to be able to hit them with communications that in the way they want to receive it and at the time they want to receive it. And then the next one is what we call purposeful automation. So being able to automate this information in such a way that you don't have to rely on staff to do work and make changes. It's all going to happen through the machine learning and the automated outbound messages, as well as allow even 2-way messaging with that patient. Like if they receive a text, they should be able to reply to that text and ask a question, and being able to pull that chat and chatbot capabilities into a true conversation with the patient without requiring staff to engage. And then the last one, just to play on, what Preeti just mentioned, is we have a remote workforce, and giving the visibility to those staff members, whether they're remote or not, that's completely in line with what is going on automatically with the patient. So knowing what they received and when they received and what their preferences are and what conversations they have had up until that point. So really a dashboard where they're able to recognize that. So there's continuity with that patient along the way. So back to you, Preeti, for the best practices. Oh, sorry.
So let's do a deep dive into the first best practice that John touched on, which is really, it all starts with segmentation. And I want to kind of share with you what we mean by advanced segmentation, because most of you guys are already used to the fact that you are using traditional P2P scores to basically segment your accounts into different queues for working them through the rev cycle spectrum. However, it's really, really important that if you are basically doing segmentation of those accounts purely using the one data variable, which is a static traditional P2P score, it's probably a flawed approach, and you could look at other attributes to actually improve the efficiency. The biggest fallacy with the traditional P2P scores is that they are deeply rooted into credit history. And the reality today is that lots of patients may just not have enough credit to calculate that P2P score to actually accurately reflect their propensity to pay. The second thing that you've got to keep in mind when you are just thinking about one of those static P2P scores is that even though the patient's credit history might not be stellar, you are not marrying it with the willingness to pay, essentially, right? I mean, they might be very, very open to making payments over a period of time as and when their ability allows for them, versus just kind of segmenting that particular patient out because their credit history basically is not a great one. So kind of factoring in the patient's willingness to pay is a very important element that sort of gets thrown away when you're just leveraging a static P2P score. The other things that I wanted to point out with the traditional P2P score, where it sort of falls down in today's day and age, is that we all touched upon the trend of how a patient's financial circumstances are getting more and more fluid each day. And the truth of the matter is that these traditional P2P scores are really snapshots of point in time. They're not really taking into account real-time data that's evolving around the patient. And so I guess we are fanatical believers that dynamic P2P scores that sort of take into account way more than just credit history are probably the best scores to use to enable your segmentation. And these dynamic P2P scores really start leveraging a lot of alternative data sources as reflected on the slide here. It could be social media usage. It could be more around the demographic information that we know about this patient. It could be about how this patient likes to engage. All of that starts helping us sort of build out this persona of a patient that goes beyond the score, and it allows us to sort of put that data and put that persona into play as we think about working with this patient to help them pay their dues as it pertains to their healthcare bills. I also think that it's really, really important that you sort of weave in what your staff is seeing as a trend line to sort of also help with your segmentation. If your staff is being particularly successful at managing certain types of accounts and certain types of patient profiles, that should absolutely sort of seep into your segmentation strategy, and that's sort of going to really result in greater efficiency. That I'll turn it to John to sort of add a little bit more on this next best practice.
Yeah, so this little graphic here is kind of meant to help illustrate how we bring this all together, right? Kind of do this deep dive on an individual patient. It's like, okay, great, we have that information, but like now how do we put this out into the wild, if you will, to start making it work? And this is just an example of 4 different patients, all very different circumstances from a capacity to pay perspective, different benefits, how they prefer to communicate, what times are best to contact them, All of these things for patients are going to be very unique and different. So in this example, like let's just take Joe, go back to Joe as the example, is a Medicare, and he's got a high capacity to pay. So we would expect, based on the balance and his capacity, that he should be able to pay in full. So we're not going to necessarily offer an automated payment plan option for him. Not that he can never get a plan if he doesn't make a call or do something, but he should be able to pay in full. We're recognizing that. And what still becomes super important, though, is the communication cadence and how he wants to be communicated with. So you've got a balance. You should be able to pay it, but how do you get him to pay it? It's making sure that we're doing the outreach on email and paper, as an example, as well as recognizing that if he's responding to text, that's going to be the predominant way that we're going to communicate with Joe, and make it very frictionless and easy for him to make that payment. If you go down to Mia as an example, is a completely different set of circumstances that may have the exact same balance that Joe owes, but Mia has high deductible. Her capacity is about $150 a month, and we can recognize that. We know that her preference for communication is text, and we know that she likes to be communicated with in the afternoon or the evening. So what we're going to be doing with Mia is reaching out to her first with text, and getting to her at a certain time of day that we know she's responsive, and then giving her the ability right up front to be able to activate a payment plan for $150 a month. And if she wants to change that plan, to make it, a shorter term, she absolutely has that capability. But from the self-service perspective, is we're giving her that offer. She can go right from her mobile phone from the text and have a pre-authenticated link that goes in for her to automatically activate that plan. She can decide what payment method she wants to put on file in a completely secure way, and then she's off to her next thing. So the idea of this is helping to drive the self-service, lower the amount, we'll touch on this in a minute, but lower the amount of phone calls that come in, lower the amount of interactions that they have to make with staff, which is never a consumer's or patient's first preference. And we're driving a lot of that out through the self-service, but in a very intelligent way.
So now let's move to the third area that I think could be leveraged in a very meaningful way to sort of impact efficiency, and that's around automation. I'll be honest, I'm a technologist at heart, so automation is always near and dear to me. But automation for the sake of automation, that does not actually result in better results or sort of freeing up time for the RCM staff to work on higher yield efforts, is basically automation thrown away. So I truly am a believer that automation has to be purposeful, and it needs to start with data. Once you understand and triangulate how the data points can be leveraged to automate the right elements in a workflow, it is totally worth automating it. So let me kind of back it up with what I'm trying to say here. Let's take the example here on the slide, right? We all know in today's day and age, most providers are leveraging some sort of third-party RPA vendor to automate their claim status. Now, let's assume that the claim status comes back as there is a patient responsibility piece in that claim status. That should automatically queue off a workflow automation that routes the specific patient account for the appropriate patient follow-up. Automating this workflow progression in that whole rev cycle spectrum, as opposed to actually having staff members look at that and make that change manually, is really impactful, because it just freed up your staff to work on other items that cannot be automated. And it's these small little iterative changes that can actually start adding up to a lot of free time that's available for your RCM staff that can be focused on patients that need more hand-holding and for patients that are more complex. There are other points in this same workflow that we're looking at that could also be points of automation, such as, and I'm going to have definitely John weigh in here, which is really based on what we know about this patient, and if it's already stored, what is the best way to contact this patient? And that could be an automation versus actually a manual touch point from an agent trying to send a letter. It should be automated if that's the best way to sort of communicate with this patient. And then last but not the least, I would say that another piece in this specific example that could lend itself to really purposeful automation would be the moment a patient actually makes the payment on a patient portal, that account balance automatically can be updated in the account profile for that agent so that there is the most up-to-date account balance being reflected for the agent to sort of work on the next step in the equation. So this is just one of the examples that I'm sort of sharing here for meaningful automation. I think the goal is always to sort of look at, when you're thinking about automation, to take a step back and say, are you automating the right things? Is it actually going to have the impact that you want? Is it really going to free up time for your RCM staff to work on higher yield efforts? That's always going to be key. The one other thing I wanted to point out here in this is that the sooner your RCM staff and your systems can sort of move and account through the rev cycle and quickly present back to the patient what is that they are responsible for, it ultimately leads to a higher willingness and a propensity for the patient to actually pay back. Nobody wants to know 3 months post encounter that suddenly as a patient now you have a large amount due. So the quicker you can move that and kind of get in front of the patient in a timely fashion, the higher the propensity and the willingness of the patient to actually pay for it or ask for alternatives to try and pay for it.
Yeah, Pri, one thing I'll just mention here also is on the automation side, I think it's important, like when we have engagements with health systems, that there is a certain level of a need for control, right? Where this is still communication with your patients in which you don't want it to be, just sort of completely machine driven. So it's important to have some level of guidelines that you set and configurations, limits, if you will, around, well, I don't want my patients to receive messages more than twice a week or something like that. Now, the hard part is having that balance. You want the machine learning to be able to understand how patients are responding, to be able to do its job, right, and to make it better. But putting some of those guidelines and limits, I think, is important balance between the staff and then allowing the automation to the patient take place. And the other thing I'll just mention is, we know also that there's a lot of third-party players at play in these types of things. So it's important also to recognize what pieces have to also come in from a third party, whether it's an estimation solution, whether it's other things that you're going to have in the system that are interacting with it as well, financial assistance, et cetera, early out partners. So those type of things are really critical to have a central way to be able to bring those together too. So it isn't just a disparate type of experience for staff as well as the patients. I think we're trying to click at the same time here, Pri. I think this is the one for you, right?
Yep. Yes. Thank you. So just to kind of round out the last best practice that John touched on earlier is how do we really put in the systems and the controls to really help support a remote workforce? It goes without saying that when you have an RCM team that feels supported, they're the greater their motivation to actually service our patients better. And when our patients are happy, the overall experience is happier and everybody wins. But as we discussed earlier, right now, there are no real support systems in place, but we can start making baby steps towards it. It first and foremost starts with having insights, right? Without data, without an understanding of what's happening with this remote workforce or with this hybrid workforce, it's really hard for most organizations or RCM leaders or supervisors to sort of titrate and calibrate and optimize. So there are two sort of sets of insights that you can sort of lean on and you should sort of really tap into. One are real-time insights, so that you sort of have a real-time, bird's eye view into all the moving elements of your revenue cycle engine. And that could be when you have higher call volume, what is the average payer time today with Humana versus Aetna? How are your patients responding to your engagement methods today? So those are some of the real-time insights that you can tap into. Combined with that, you've also got to have aggregate insights that you should be absolutely tapping into and looking into, which is really how is your overall team doing towards achieving their goals? Where are they actually stumbling? What are the training opportunities that you need to provide in this new environment to them? Once you have these data elements in your back pocket, you're able to actually influence the right processes, the right trainings that you can provide your remote and hybrid workforce to sort of give them the confidence and the tools that they need to be successful at their jobs. The second thing that I wanted to point out that you should sort of consider when you are trying to manage this remote workforce is absolutely giving them a holistic engagement suite. It cannot be just them. So giving them access to a whole wide variety of slew of engagement options so that they have the ability to sort of take off a lot of pressure from themselves, whether it's kind of sending a text or automating an action of a letter going out. That's really going to help the support and support basically your agents' capacity to do their jobs really well. And then last but not the least, I think it goes without saying that when all these agents are in one room and the supervisor was able to walk the floors, or they were able to sort of peer over their colleague and ask for help, that goes away. So you have to be really, really mindful that you are sort of leveraging tools to provide them real-time assistance, provide them coaching, and also in a lot of ways ensuring that you're managing the compliance and the QA aspects of your team so that you feel good about the kind of service that they're providing to the patients. Net, what I will say is that there are a lot of really good small baby steps that you can start taking to sort of start supporting your agents, because once your agents are happy and they feel supported and they feel trained and coached, they're going to be very motivated to ultimately pass on that satisfaction in their interactions with their patients, which is going to net yield a better patient financial experience, and it's going to be a win-win across the board. The patients are satisfied, the business is doing well, and your employees and your team members are feeling really good as well.
So just to kind of wrap this one up and then turn it over to Preeti on the last slide to talk about some metrics is, so, you know, it kind of sum this up is we're trying to drive relevant contextual insights, right? Number one is when you drive those that do the segmentation, you drive the insights, you're able to look at all of this stuff and then being able to enable that consumer-driven experience, right? And that's through the engagement side of things and the omni-channel and the different staff experience as well. And then also being able to streamline and automate those workflows, right? So contextual insights, driving the experience for the patient, automating these workflows so that, it's not something that is kind of the old guard school way of doing revenue cycle management. And at the end, as Preeti has described so well, is supporting all the aspects of the remote revenue cycle workforce as well. Anything you want to add there, Preeti?
No, I think you summed it up really well. And so when you actually take all of this into account, there are some really, really compelling stats that we can take a look at. And I wanted to show that to you, which is we've sort of seen some of these best practices being put in motion. And what we're seeing from early results is that your organization is going to be able to collect more. You're going to be able to create an environment that's human for your patients, that feels empathetic, and it's going to motivate your patients to have a better financial experience, and they're going to want to figure out a way to make their payments. And last but not the least, overall, your employees are going to be happy. And so here are just some of the stats that I wanted to touch on, right? Which is we've seen 15% increase in patient payments. We've seen agent productivity improve because through automation, we're reducing the payer hold times. We've seen that our agents can sort of handle a lot more through automation and thereby reducing the call volume that's coming in from the patients. And then we're seeing an increased willingness to sort of do claim follow-up in a very, very streamlined fashion that ultimately gives you an overall billing satisfaction scores nearing around 4.4 to 5. So these are pretty compelling stats. And the goal is to sort of have a combination of these best practices combined with technology to sort of gain better efficiency for the organizations in general. So with that, I actually wanted to end the presentation by actually saying, John, thank you so much for joining me in today's presentation. I wanted to kind of let our attendees know that Finwire and Flywire have really partnered our collective passions together with our market-leading solutions to really take on this challenge of solving the patient financial crisis that's here and that's facing us, and really try to collectively pool solutions and best practices for our customers to create really more of an intelligent, improved, and humanized experience that sort of is a win-win for the providers, the patients, and the employees. I also at this point wanted to really thank all of our attendees for their attentions, and would really now like to pass it back to Jacob to sort of facilitate any of the questions that might have come in.
Thank you so much, Preeti and John, for that fantastic presentation. We're now going to be transferring over to today's question and answer session. Attendees, please submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboard. We'll try to get through as many as we can as we have time for. Preeti, my first question is for you. With the patient affordability concerns becoming more prominent and legislation driving direction towards price transparency, how do you recommend addressing the front end?
Wow, that's a fantastic question and very timely given everything that's happening in our current market space. Let me start off by saying the front end is changing pretty dramatically, again, accelerated through COVID. And we're seeing that automation for things like pre-access, pre-registration, scheduling are absolutely ripe for automation, and we're seeing provider systems automating that piece really, really well. But when it comes to sort of tackling the financial obligations that go in with this, I think we need to be mindful. As I mentioned earlier, we shouldn't automate for the sake of automating, and we shouldn't take away the human element in trying to interact with patients. So if in this upfront workflow, the patient financial obligation is going to be a big one or an expensive one. And by the way, that's always relative for each patient. It's probably not in the best interest of the provider system to sort of automate this. This is the time when you actually put your RCM staff on the phone with the patient to better understand how we can get them the service, and make it affordable to them. And again, in that discussion, I would tap into what both John and I covered. Data about that patient will allow us to contextualize the conversation that the RCM staff is going to have with the patient. If we know that they could be eligible for charity, or we know that, what is their willingness to pay, we could upfront offer them a patient payment plan. And that makes the discussion go much further, more human, more empathetic. Having said that, I will say that there's a kicker to it. We always know that there's RCM staff shortages. So automating the back end that we spoke about actually frees up time for your RCM staff to actually tackle some of these important conversations that need to happen at the front end. And I would say, again, kind of tapping into what we all spoke about, leveraging dynamic P2P scoring, leveraging what we know around how the patient wants to be communicated with. All of that needs to sort of go in for having a very meaningful impact. So the more work you put in building that data, leveraging that persona, you're going to have far more impact.
Some great advice there. Thank you, Preeti. John, we want to automate the right tasks to optimize performance. How do you identify what makes sense to automate, and what should maybe remain as a task for manual efforts?
Jacob, maybe I'll take that. Yeah, I'll take that, right, John? Let me start off, and then you can obviously add to it. So I think again, we talked about automation, and I will kind of state the obvious here again, which is we're seeing a lot of people spend energy in automating stuff just so that they can, what feels like to us, checking the box. So you can take, I've seen a lot of systems out there that are trying to automate a denial management process, but they're not really seeing the efficacy of that automation. Because you can automate tasks, but if you don't take a step back and say, what is actually causing those denials, you've just automated for the sake of automation without actual yield. So going back to purposeful automation, I think in order to do things right, my recommendation once again would be to take a step back, do truly a fishbone of the workflow that you're trying to automate, or parts of the workflow that you feel like lend themselves to be automated. Marry that with the data that you have around the accounts that you typically have to manage as an organization. And then think about it holistically about which portions of that workflow that you're going to automate. I will also kind of caution that one and done never works. So just because you've automated a certain section of your workflow and you're not seeing the results, you should be absolutely open to kind of going back and iterating it and changing it and saying, nope, this is not a piece of the workflow that I'm going to automate, because it actually resulted in reduced collections, bad NPS from the patients. We want our highly licensed, groomed, trained RCM staff to have that engagement with the patient. And then, and if it worked, fantastic, let's continue down that thing. But net, I would say take a step back, look at the process holistically, be open to change, and then start doing it in a meaningful way, as opposed to saying, I'm going to check the box and I'm going to claim automation. So hopefully that helps, Jacob.
Very much. Thank you, Preeti. The next question. We get about 60,000 calls a month across our hospitals, and reducing that volume is a big initiative for us this year. So your results intrigued me. Can you talk more about the strategies that help in this area?
Sure. Pretty, I could start with that one. You can add. So I think we've certainly talked a lot about the self-service aspect of enabling patients to know what they owe, what their options are, and being able to move to payment. So that certainly is going to have a huge impact in making it a frictionless experience to reduce phone call volume. But I think I mentioned it briefly, and I'll just kind of double click on it, is one of the biggest aspects is more so than me is the AI around chat as well as two-way texting. Again, we'll go back to the point of that is, let's take chat for a second. There's two components to chat, right? There's chat bots, of which you're enabling the machine with questions and answers to be able to go back and forth automatically with that patient. And then there's staff-assisted chat, of which it kicks off to a staff member where it's a more complicated answer for them to be able to answer those questions directly. So what we found with customers that have really made that sort of next level of improvement, decrease in phone calls, is deploying more of this chat and two-way texting capabilities because it takes still a lot of the interaction questions off the table, and then really focuses the staff on the calls that are really necessary, because some just are going to be necessary to serve the patient. But that would, beyond the things that we mentioned, I would say certainly the chat and chatbot technologies is our goal for that.
Perfect. Chat technologies. Thank you, John. And my last question for you two, and this is for either of you to answer or contribute to. We're focused on making investments to create a better consumer experience for our patients, but want to make sure that the things we implement complement our current technology. We're a health system that uses multiple EHRs throughout our hospitals, which makes it even more complicated. How does what you've talked about today work with our EHR structure?
Yeah, so I'll start with this. Like, this is Preeti mentioned, the partnership with Finby and Flywire, and there's certain aspects that workflows, force automation, and things that Preeti's been talking about that Finby is experts in. And one of the things that Flywire brings to the table to the partnership also is the ability to integrate with any EHR, and not just the ability to integrate with any EHR, but it's more so having standard protocols of which we integrate with, whether it's Epic or Cerner or Meditech, Allscripts, et cetera. And then a critical thing there for us to be able to do on an EHR is, like, when you look at these interactions, the biggest mistake a hospital can make is by going just by the billing cycles of the EHR. Many of them are going to be sending balances due and based on the visit level and the account level. But the guarantor may have several accounts and visits. So it's helping to bring those in a consolidated way so that the guarantor can see everything that they owe for all their visits across the health system and affiliates, and then being able to deal with that one balance based on their segmentation and capacity to pay, et cetera. So don't deal with each visit, but deal with the aggregate of what that consumer is looking at. So we enable the EHRs, and in some cases, multiple EHRs, and like your case with this question, across the system, of which you want to standardize the experience. And that's essentially what we do, is we're taking in data from different EHRs, standardizing it, creating a single consolidated guarantor experience, and then being able to deliver that to the consumers. So high level answer, certainly we can unpack that one forever, but anything to add, Preeti?
Yeah, I'm just going to actually piggyback on what you said, right? We have a lot of our provider customers that are on disparate EHRs, and they're at different stages. So there is an opportunity where customers are probably trying to move to a single instance of the EHR, but in the meantime, they're still trying to manage the patient financial experience for the patients. And in that case, we've really sort of complemented and augmented the EHR strategy, which is you want to have the experience for the patient not be disjointed. So we'll sort of, again, very similar to what John said, tap into the inputs from each of the EHRs, consolidate the patient record in patient financial record, please let me be very clear on that, and sort of work that patient financial record from one system. So we've seen tremendous amount of synergies when you do that. And that's what our customers appreciate, the fact that you're not having multiple phone calls or multiple outreaches or multiple engagements happening because that patient exists in multiple EHRs, that you're actually able to consolidate that into one system, build out a holistic view of this patient, and then you're sort of leveraging the right financial engagement methodology to reach out to them with a consolidated voice. So something that we deal with on a regular basis, and that's going to be reality for the foreseeable future. So something that we should absolutely keep in mind and sort of collaborate with our clients to figure out what is the win-win there.
Thank you both for your answers to that question. We do have one last audience question, and this is for you both. Are you segmenting out another option, such as a patient who can't afford one treatment, but they can another?
I'll start off and then I'll probably have John jump in. From our angle, when we think about segmentation, we're really thinking at it from a patient affordability angle. As John pointed out, sometimes patients are just not seeking the care because they believe that they can't afford the treatment. And that's just wrong on so many different levels. So our goal here with our segmentation and the persona that we're trying to build out is to actually go back to them with affordability options. Treatment options obviously require clinical decision support, and that's not where we're sort of anchoring it in. That should really come from their clinicians vis-a-vis us. So just, hopefully that helps answer the angle with which we are looking at segmentation. And John, if you have anything more to add.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add in seeing this question about, one treatment over another, is there are a lot of rules that we place into our workflow that deal with procedure codes, right? But most of the rules center around, do you want to treat one procedure different? Maybe your estimate at pre-service, as an example, is really inaccurate for a particular surgical procedure that you don't necessarily want to put a patient on a payment plan until the claim's been adjudicated. And you can drive those rules in at the pre-service level. But to Preeti's point, at the end of the day, we're dealing with the patient's aggregate balance that they owe, and then engaging them with that overall balance to make it easier for them to pay. So their decision of being able to afford one treatment or another comes into play long before they register. And what we're doing is hopefully getting to a point where the hospital can give the patient confidence that regardless of what treatment it is, they're going to be able to pay monthly based on their affordability. And that's really what we're trying to drive in terms of the overall process with the patient, between the provider and the patient.
Well, thank you very much for your answers to you both on those questions. That is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Preeti and John for an excellent discussion and presentation, and also to Finvi for sponsoring today's webinar. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions. And thank you again both so much for joining us today. We hope to see you at future Becker's webinars.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it.